Good morning, you guys. I'm so excited to be here with you this morning as we talk about copyright. Copyright is a very important part of research, and you guys are fixing to dive into research. So as I go over the slide presentation, I would like for you to follow along on the notes that I made. I would like for you to fill in the blanks as we go through this presentation. When we talk about copyright, there are a couple of things that we need to know. We need to know what it is. We need to know who owns what. We need to know why copyright is important. And we need to know how do we apply it. If you're not familiar with the term copyright, we're going to first go over the dictionary definition. According to the Online Dictionary for Library and Information Science, or ODLIS, the term copyright means the executive legal rights granted by a government to an author, editor, compiler, composer, playwright, publisher, or distributor to publish, produce, sell, or distribute copies of a literary, musical, dramatic, artistic, or other work within certain limitations, fair use, and first sale. Copyright also governs the right to prepare derivative works, reproduce a work or portions of it, and display or perform a work in public. That is a lot of words. My definition is copyright means that the original creator of a work owns that work. We can borrow it, but it is not ours, nor should we pass it off as ours. Let's look at an analogy. If I'm mowing my lawn and my lawnmower breaks, I can go next door and borrow a lawnmower from the next door neighbor and get my lawn mowed. Now, whose lawnmower is it? It's still my next door neighbor's. Even if I borrowed it, even if I used it, it still belongs to my next door neighbor. I just borrowed it. So if someone's walking down the street and they say, "Mrs. Ward, what a wonderful lawnmower," it's not right for me to say, "Why, thank you, I do have a wonderful lawnmower." What's right is for me to say, "I borrowed this lawnmower from my neighbor." That's the same thing as that we talk about when we talk about copyright. It's borrowing someone else's words. Or poems. So let's look at who owns what. Authors own their books. Poets own poems. Songwriters and singers own songs. Artists own paintings and sculptures. Photographers own photographs. So if I want to use a song, if I want to sing a song in public and get paid for it, which is rather laughable, I need to ask the songwriter to give me permission to do that. And a lot of times, there's another entity that owns things as well, and that's the entity called the publisher. If I write a poem and that poem is published in a book, the publisher also owns rights to that poem. Copyright is important because when we take things that do not belong to us, we're stealing. And when we take ideas that do not belong to us, that is also stealing. For example, if someone asks me about libraries and I say, "But libraries are about freedom, freedom to read, freedom of ideas, freedom of communication. They are about education, which is not a process that finishes the day we leave school or university, about entertainment, about making safe spaces, and about access to information." I believe all of those things to be true. However, I wasn't the original person that said that. An author named Neil Gaiman said that. And so if I quote him, I need to give him credit for being the person that I'm quoting. As you do your research, you're going to possibly quote people as well. Now, things that we don't have to quote, things that are common. After someone sneezes, we don't have to say, "Bless you," according to my mom, or my mom would say, "Bless you." We can just say "bless you" because that's common courtesy. If someone falls, we say, "Are you okay?" And we don't have to quote that because that's a common way to say things. We can also say answers to fact-based questions. If I ask how to say red in Spanish, you don't have to quote a Spanish book. You can just say roja. If I ask you what 4 times 4 is, you don't have to quote your math teacher. You can just say 4 times 4 is 16. So things that are common, things that are fact-based, we don't have to give credit to someone else for saying first. Now, another phrase that we talk about is fair use. Fair use is an exception to copyright that is used for teachers and students. And fair use says that teachers and students can have a little bit of leeway depending on why they're using the material, depending on why the work was created and how much is being used. If I use a little snippet in a lesson, that could be called fair use. Also, if I say, if I give you a paragraph that I want you to read, then I can use that under the laws that govern fair use. However, if I make a copy of a book and say, we're going to read this book, and I'm going to make a copy of it so that you don't have to go out and buy it, or that the school district doesn't have to go out and buy it, that's not fair use. That's stealing, and that's going to affect their money. And this information, if you'll notice, I got this information from Smaldino, who wrote a book in 2019, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. But I got this information from her book, and so I'm going to give her credit, her and her team credit for having said it. And now, let's practice. John reads a book and tells his friend about how great the book is. He tells the friend the name of the book. He tells his friend the author. He even pulls the book out of his backpack to show his friend the cover. Has John broken copyright? No, John has not broken copyright. John gave all the credit to the author of the book. He says, "Hey, man, you need to read this book." I like it when John tells people what books they need to read. In this scenario, Mrs. Stewart asks John to write a story for creative writing. So, John summarizes the plot that he read last week in his AR book. Now, is this a violation of copyright? Yes, this is a violation of copyright because John's passing off a story that someone else wrote. A story that he read, he's passing it off as his own. John needs to write an original story for Mrs. Stewart and not try to steal a story and say, "Oh, I wrote this," when he didn't write it. So, if we compare the two, if you read a book and you tell someone about it and give the credit to the author, then that's okay. But if you just take someone else's work and try to pass it off as your own, that is not okay. How long does copyright last? Copyright lasts 70 years after an author's death in the case of a book. And who do I ask to use copyrighted materials? You're generally going to ask the publisher. The reason you want to ask the publisher is because sometimes the author gets a lot of fan mail, or sometimes you may have a time limit that you need to use this copyrighted material early. When the high school gets ready to do the one-act play, one of the things that the director of the one-act play does is contact the publisher and say, we want to perform this play, and there will be 2 public performances, or there will be 3 public performances. There will be 1 performance that we're preparing for contest, and there will be 2 performances that are for the parents, or something like that. So Mrs. Mancha, as she's getting ready to do the one-act play, she contacts the publisher, because that's what the publisher's kind of the middleman to handle those kinds of things. Again, I got this information from Smaldino's book. Now then, when we talk about royalty-free means that we're using materials that students and teachers are able to use for educational purposes. If we think again about the example of the one-act play, sometimes we have sound effects in the play. If a student who's in charge of sound makes those sound effects, then they can make those sound effects without having to pay for the sound. But if they played a Taylor Swift song for the introduction, then the play would have to have permission to use the Taylor Swift song. So there's a branch of materials that are called royalty-free, and that means that you can use those for educational purposes. Even when you use royalty-free materials, we need to make sure that we use the materials correctly. So, what is copyright? Copyright is not stealing someone else's work and calling it our own. Who owns what? An author owns a book, a poet owns a play, and a publisher will own these things as well. Copyright is important so that we give credit to the people who said things first, or the people who sang things first. And we apply copyright when we give credit. This last slide is a slide of my references. And when we use references, we are giving credit to those who have said things, those who we have quoted in our work. So Neil Gaiman, I used that quote about libraries. He wrote a book called The View from the Cheap Seats. And so I am giving him credit right here. I gave you the dictionary definition for copyright. And so I'm giving credits to J.M. Wrights for writing the online dictionary that I used. I used several bits of specific information from Smaldino, Lothar, and Mims, their book, Instructional Technology and Media for Learning. So I'm giving them credit. Also at the bottom, it says these slides created using slidesgo.com. That's another way that I give credit for the people who have used information and products that I've used in this presentation. Unless quoted, the words in the presentation were mine, but the slides, the actual, like the lemons and the visual things, those were created by SlidesGo. And so it's only right that I give them credit, because it's not fair for me to take credit for their work. It's not, that's not okay. So as you dive into the world of research, be sure to research well and give credit to the people who said things before you did. Thank you guys. Have a great day.